solicited some questions. I had a lot of people that emailed me and people that have a lot of questions. But I'll just jump right into it with you. I was just listening.
We should start with Paul Sharps, and the answer to his is go fuck yourself.
You know what's funny about that? I had no idea what he was talking about until Ray posted the picture, and I was like, wow, you know what? That's really is kind of amazing likeness.
I've actually been getting that one for years.
Okay.
About once a month, somebody will email me, be like, hey, man, did you know that you look like the lead singer of Creed? And I just write back a middle finger emoticon and move on with my day.
Let me cross that question up. So I was listening to the podcast, the second podcast you did with Mike Glover, which was great. He seems like a good guy.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah. But, you mentioned you're getting a lot of questions, and I'm getting a lot of questions. I get this question everywhere I go and everywhere I travel because I'm in Portland. And it's phrased in different ways, but roughly the question is something along the lines of, what are you going to do when they show up in your neighborhood as they've been doing, and they're knocking on the door, and people are asking me for some kind of advice on that particular situation. And just to put another fine point on it, I've had a lot of my students who, and I have students on all ranges of political spectrum. I really don't care about people's politics, but students that are left of me that I know would never have otherwise considered owning guns that have bought guns within the last month.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the delayed response time we have here in Portland. We had a story of a kid that was held at knife point a few weeks ago. It took, I think, an hour and 15 minutes for the police to respond. So people are starting to figure it out. And there's people that we have new gun owners that have never had a gun before. And a lot of people asking questions about that kind of self-defense. So I know that's a very broad question, but how are you answering that when you get those kind of questions?
Yeah, I'm certainly getting the same type for sure. And the quantity has not decreased over the past few months. It's rapidly increased. I actually think the last stat that I read was 40% of gun purchases in the last few months are from people who are first-time buyers. And a total hypothesis would be, in my mind, probably a lot of those people were either on the fence on the Second Amendment or were likely against gun ownership. And for clarity for people listening to this or watching this, I don't care where you land on the issue. I mean, the Second Amendment is the Second Amendment. Buy a gun or don't buy a gun. I don't really care. But it is a tough one. The biggest thing that I try to caution people against is this mystique or idea that the possession of a gun is somehow equals safety, because it really doesn't. There's so many variables. And I get questions on everything from what do you think of this brand of firearm? What do you think of this type of ammo? To what gun should I carry in my car? What gun should I carry for everyday carrier, what people call EDC? What gun is best for home defense? What caliber is best for home defense? I mean, it's just rabbit hole of just cascading questions. The answer one, it drives three more. So I try to start broad. I don't, the thing is, I'm not an expert on like guns. I know how to use a gun. I was trained how to use a gun. I used a gun for a very long time professionally, but I'm not an expert at the inner workings. I'm not an expert at all of the brands of firearms. I mean, I used, an AR/M4 platform for the vast majority of my career. And then we were carrying Mark 17s, which is the Scar Heavy, which shoots 7.62. And I had a Sig Sauer P226, really, for my entire career. I know a lot about those three types of guns. But beyond that, I understand how to utilize them safely and training and all of that. But it's tough for me to give a brand recommendation. So I always just start broadly. And I tell people, if you want to get a gun, that's great. But it's not a Harry Potter wand. If you have a gun at your house, that doesn't mean that you're going to be safe. Because if you're going to possess a gun, one of the first things I'll say after opening the conversation is, if you're going to buy a weapon, and in my opinion, guns are designed to kill. And I often hear people avoiding saying exactly that because I think they're somehow afraid intellectually that it's going to scare people. And I don't think that it should. There's nothing wrong with saying that the tool is designed to take life. But if you can wrap your head around that concept, the safe storage of that weapon also becomes a very important conversation. So the possession of a gun is a great thing if you choose to, but you also have to be a responsible gun owner. So safe storage and the selection of the weapon you're going to buy, I think, have to happen in the same conversation. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable about the time it may take to access a firearm. And in the modern era of simple biometric safes that you can have on a nightstand, or I mean, I have a couple in my house. It's a fingerprint swipe, and you're in it in a quarter of a second. I mean, that argument really doesn't hold that much water for me. So I start with broad, what is it that you think you would use the gun for? When people ask me, for home defense, most times I point people towards a shotgun because it's relatively easy to handle. There's nothing more fear-inspiring than the sound of a nice Mossberg being racked in the dark. I would immediately change whatever I had in mind and go in the opposite direction. And for some people, they don't, they want to have an AR platform or a pistol. And on the AR platform, I just tell people to, there's so many options. You're going to probably have to go off of one that's based off of economics. And the same thing with the pistol. For pistols, if people are looking for a gun to carry, and it depends on how they carry it. If for concealed carry, I tend to get people more towards the compact or subcompact because you can actually be concealable. If they want to have a gun at the house, I would say something more along the line of full size. But what I tell people is go to a gun store or go to a gun range, and you need to pick up and touch as many guns as you can. And I would start with that. Don't start at the caliber, start at the gun and how it feels in your hand. Because if it feels too big or too heavy or you're not comfortable holding it, it's not going to get any better when you introduce the ammunition and it starts jumping around in your head. And then from there, I'll go to ammunition. And for most people, they're like, I need a 357 Magnum. It's like, hey, take it easy, Dirty Harry. You don't need to have a street sweeper in your closet. I mean, if you want to, go ahead, but be aware you might break your wrist when that thing cracks off. For most people, I would say somewhere, 9mm or a 45. And I say those two ammunitions because they're the easiest to source generally. Right now, there's an ammunition storage, and almost all ammo is difficult to source. But most police departments and officers and military are shooting 9mm or 45. If you go to a small town somewhere and you want to shoot, you're probably going to be able to find 9mm or 45. If you have an obscure or an off-type ammunition, it might be harder to find. And the reality is, if you hit what you're aiming at, the caliber of the bullet is less important. I mean, a 22 is a lethal round between the eyes, just like a 9mm is, or 40 ACP or 45 ACP, or fill in the blank. I mean, it's about your ability to control the weapon and put rounds on target where you're actually aiming. That's the critical factor. And if you have a handgun that has a caliber that you're uncomfortable shooting because it jumps around too much, or you're scared of the recoil, you're less likely to do that. So it starts with how it feels, then the right ammo, and then it goes into this conversation of training.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be current, you have to be competent. And if you're neither of those things, I would highly recommend not having a gun on you, because you're as much of a risk to yourself and to the people around you. You're equally as a risk as you are with the capability to protect yourself. And this conversation is a tough one because it takes time. It's a nuanced conversation. It's not, I can't say go buy Smith & Wesson, fill in the blank, blah, 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 and you're at home and you're good. Right. You have to put together a strategy of how many rounds are you going to shoot? Are you going to, conceal carry? What are the requirements in your state to go and conceal carry? Do you have an understanding of the laws in the state that you live? Like, you mentioned people, coming into neighborhoods and knocking on doors. And I had this conversation with somebody, I think it might've been Brian Bishop recently. We were talking about castle doctrine, which Montana is a castle doctrine state, but it's, in my own research, not all states read it the same. From my understanding, in Texas, castle doctrine is the end of your property. Mm-hmm. In Montana, it is not the end of your property. It's the beginning of your domicile. And you need to be aware of where the line in the sand sits from a legal perspective, because even if you are completely justified in taking the life of another human being in your own self-defense, you need to be prepared to have a microscope shoved up your ass, and you need to be on the right side of the law, or you're going to end up in criminal or potentially civil court. There's a lot more to it than going to a gun store and filling out a piece of paper and walking out with your first gun.
For sure. Now, how about tactics? So here's a question. When they first started tearing down statues, it made me very angry. But I think a lot of people misinterpreted my anger as, well, that's just property. And I think the point that they were missing was actually that's the creation of a mob. And what I'm worried about is the mob. And then, of course, the mob has gone on now in Portland for, I think, 120 days. And just about every one of those 120 days, they've tried to set fire to something or hurt somebody, and usually a police officer. And on a few occasions, they've gone into residential neighborhoods. Those residential neighborhoods are located where there's a police department. So really the target is the police department, but they're going into those neighborhoods. And I understand how it can feel good on the other side of the fence when you're watching the news and you see a business owner, a small business owner standing in front of his property with a rifle. I get it. He's doing something. He's standing up against a mob, and there's some bravery there. And it does, I'd be lying if I didn't say it makes me feel good to see that to a certain extent. But the flip side of that is, like you and Mike were talking about, it's not smart. It's
Correct.
not necessarily the smart thing to do. So when somebody comes into the neighborhood or somebody's outside your store, what is your advice to people who are worried about that?
I think Mike nailed it really well in the podcast. And it's not that the store owner is, I don't like the terms right or wrong. If most of the videos you'll see, it's a store owner with a AR type platform standing and verbally engaging, arguing, sometimes mere feet from individuals in front of his storefront. And Mike's point on the podcast was, the effective range of that weapon system, a 5.56 weapon system, it can be hundreds of yards. Mm-hmm. Why close that distance? And actually, in a lot of these videos, I watch them, and the distance that they are from the person that they're talking to, their weapon is almost always slung at not even a low ready, but it's the barrel is down. That person could put their hand out and prevent them from ever actually presenting the weapon in a usable fashion. Whether or not either of those two parties realize that, I don't know, but that's one of the first things that I see. So if you're going to have these tools, understand the effective range of these tools. And Mike's theory of, basically putting up warnings to people like, hey, this property will be protected by the owners inside of their rights, and then giving yourself some standoff distance is the way, it's the avenue that I would take. The direct confrontation, closing the distance, disadvantaging yourself so you can't really control the space and distance. It's not a great strategy. I'm not saying that it can't work, but what you're going to need, if you're standing in front of a crowd and you have an AR slung in front of you with the barrel down, and that crowd decides to move on you or your business, the one thing that you're going to need is distance and space to actually get the weapon up and start using it, which is the one thing you're removing from yourself if you're standing right in front of there and arguing with them face to face. And I don't want to tell people how to protect their property because, for one, I'm not an expert on the law. And my tolerance and threshold for violence is very, very different than most people. But I would, if it was me as my business, I would take the advice that Mike laid out, because I do believe that what he said was correct, or the most correct that I've seen so far. The warnings up front, giving yourself some space and distance. I would have video cameras up everywhere to document, because again, you have to think about this from the perspective of criminal and civil court as well. That's the world that we live in. Put everything in your favor. And the one thing that I feel like is missing a lot in this conversation is individual accountability and responsibility. If you try to hit me in the head with a skateboard and I shoot you in the face, that's not my fault. That's your fault. You chose to make a skateboard a deadly weapon. If you throw a brick at me or a Molotov cocktail and I end your life, well, the person that should be looked at is the one who's laying in the ground with a moonroof in their head, because they earned that, and that's what they're going to get.
Yeah, we both completely agree on that. The problem is you're going to have a life of civil suits against you and misery, even if you're in the right? The quote unquote.
And so the other, what's the other alternative? Take the skateboard to the head and that crazy mob that might potentially, and I don't like the mob either, because individuals I'm worried about less. You get a group of 3 to 5 people with a bad idea, I start getting really, really concerned. You turn that into hundreds, it's not a good deal. And there's few tools that are as capable as firearms to deal with crowds of that size.
Yeah. One of the other questions I'm getting all the time, which I'm sure you're getting all the time, is related to police officer training. And there are some aspects to it. I mean, for me, I think the ultimate answer is they need more training. They're asking for more training. And with the defunding the police movement and everything that's going on, it's going the opposite direction. The first thing the department's cut is training.
Yeah.
And they don't even have the manpower to cover the calls right now, let alone put those officers through additional training. So everything is going to get worse. It's going completely backwards. But underlying a lot of the questions people have about violence, I can see just a general, and they're well-intentioned, but a general misunderstanding about violence. Questions like, why don't they shoot him in the leg? Or, well, with Jacob Blake in particular. They had his hand on, one guy had his hand on his shirt. He only had a knife. You know, why did they have to shoot him? And obviously, people just don't understand what knives can do, don't understand how fast the situations happen, don't understand the distance, all that kind of stuff. And my question for you is, how can we fix that without putting people through simulations where they get to experience it to some degree? How can we help educate the public? Because I think that that's a huge part of what's going on right now.
Yeah, it's a tough one. People have this academic perspective of violence, and it is so incredibly far removed from the practical execution of violence. I hear the comments, well, just shoot him in the leg. Like, that's idiotic. For one, being shot in the leg is not guarantee you're not going to die. There's veins and arteries. You shoot somebody in the femur, they can bleed out into their hamstring and quad space. I know that because I've seen it happen. And it's one of the most painful ways to die, because that bone just turns into shards. It's not the way that you want to go. Also, it's really hard to do if they're moving. So and I don't know how to bridge that gap. It's so easy to sit back and Monday morning quarterback. You know, I actually think the space shuttle would fly better if it was pink, but NASA never hits me up. And I don't know anything about space travel either. So it's probably best if I keep my mouth shut.
Right.
And that's the theory that I wish a lot of people would at least recognize in themselves. Like, oh, I don't actually know what it takes to put a badge on and enforce the laws that we as a society have agreed upon. I don't know what it takes to be on the receiving end of violence. I've never been on the execution end of violence. So maybe what I need to do is educate myself instead of espousing my uneducated opinion. Now, again, they're entitled to their opinion. First Amendment applies to everybody, but not all opinions are equal in their value and quality. And quite frankly, some of the stuff I see is just in here is idiotic. I mean, I would love for Portland, I wouldn't like them to actually do this, but I would like them to take their 911 call center for a day and just send it directly to voicemail. And let me know how people like that. Every 911 call for a 24-hour time period is going to go to voicemail because we have defunded the police. And nobody wants that. People are not prepared to be their own first responder. I mean, you visited where I've lived many times, and you're talking on average. I mean, if I'm lucky where I live south of Kalispell, 30-minute response time, maybe a 45, and that's with them being fully staffed. It just takes time for them to get there. So I don't look at law enforcement as my first line of defense. I mean, I'm my first line of defense, and I understand that my headspace on that might be a little bit different, but I don't know how to change people's perspective of the violence that is a part of the law enforcement occupation. I mean, that's the bottom line, that there is an essence and an element of violence in the description of that job, because spoiler alert, not everybody feels that the law applies to them. And sometimes I don't either. I feel that the speed limit is inappropriate sometimes. So I go whatever space I want to. And I also jaywalk like a son of a bitch. However, if a cop tells me to do something, I do what the cop says, because I'm not going to street lawyer. I'm not going to sit there and try to argue my way out of it. I will deal with that later, because I put respect and trust in law enforcement. And I think a lot of that has been lost, but it hasn't been lost through direct interaction with people. It's been lost through these uncontrollable firestorm messages that, these completely statistically anomalous events in comparison to the overall interactions that law enforcement has. Those things lead the news, and people are losing faith and trust in an organization where at this point in time, I mean, all I want to do is just kind of wrap my arms around some of these officers and say, hey, like, there's people here who still support you. Like, I get it. I don't have a good answer on how we change people's minds, because it seems like attention spans are dwindling, not getting larger. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you say something that somebody doesn't agree with or they don't understand, they're just on to the next, or they're going to throw a talking point back at you. And I don't know how you have a conversation in that environment.
Yeah, the media has a huge, huge role to play in this.
They're in my opinion, they're extremely culpable in what's going on.
100%, yeah. I think anybody that really takes and it doesn't take long, a couple hours, I think you can understand the statistics as it relates to police shootings in the United States. And I think anybody that's taken the time to do that, after you watch any of the cable news networks, including Fox sometimes, and see how they cover, or most mainstream media outlets cover the police shootings, it's very hard to take the media seriously after that. I don't know how
Yep.
police take the media seriously after that. Because you
I mean,
realize how
yeah,
incendiary and biased it is in their reporting. It's absurd.
I look at the Breonna Taylor incident that just happened, and just so everybody is very clear on my thoughts, I don't want anybody to die. I don't want anybody to be killed by the police. I don't want to kill anybody. And you look at, there was almost no way that situation was not going to get turned into something burning somewhere or something getting torn down somewhere. And the reality is it had already started burning before they even came out. And it wasn't even a verdict, right? That was just the grand jury. And the grand jury didn't even think that there was enough evidence to charge any of those officers with manslaughter because they were executing their duties to the best of their abilities. And to be honest, if there is actually a lawsuit for the officer, I think they charged him with reckless endangerment because some of his rounds penetrated drywall, which, again, spoiler alert, that's what 40 cal rounds do. 40 millimeters. Like, I don't think that he's going to be able to be found guilty because he was executing his job. But I feel like they charged him with that because they had to do something, because they are letting the tail wag the horse.
Yeah.
If we don't do anything, it's going to burn.
Right.
And if on the other, it's so out of control. And again, people aren't waiting for the facts to come out. They hear shooting, burn, and then things take time. There's a reason why in the Constitution we have the right to a jury of our peers. That doesn't happen in 12 hours. That takes time. The legal and judicial process. Guess what, people? Law enforcement officers do exactly the same process that we are. So maybe take a knee for a second before lighting where you live on fire.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Military questions. We've got quite a few of those. Here's one. Do you think a female SEAL would be an asset on a SEAL team?
I saw that question and I was thinking about it, and you just need to take the gender out of that because the SEAL occupation is driven, the standards of training are driven off of the demands of the battlefield. And it is completely blind to male or female or whatever gender pronoun that you want to use. It is completely and utterly irrelevant. So the training standards are based off the real world challenges that the occupation faces. And I don't care what you have between your legs. If you can come to the training and meet the standard, then I would welcome you with open arms into the SEAL teams. Would putting a female into the SEAL teams just to say that a female was put into the SEAL teams to be beneficial? Absolutely
not. Stapes, who's one of our UK instructors, I believe he was a Royal Marine, but he was asking if you had worked with UK forces before, and if so, what your thoughts were.
I've worked with them very, very briefly, and a lot of it was pre 9/11. What I will say is overseas, they had beer in their compounds, so we didn't work together often, but sometimes we would debrief and hang out. And they're awesome. I get asked that question a lot, like Canadian forces or Aussie forces, I have nothing but great things to say about every military branch that I have worked with from every allied country. I've had phenomenal experiences with every one of them.
Someone else asked about your opinion of the TV show SEAL Team.
It can most aptly be described as dog shit.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything that you see on a screen of any size from iPhone to iMac, it's entertainment. It's not education, it's entertainment. So take it as, if you take it as entertainment, then, fire away, have fun, enjoy. Sure. But it's not a documentary. Let's not forget that.
For sure. Have you seen any of that have come out that you liked and thought, that kind of captures my experience to some degree?
I refuse to watch them.
Okay.
So I'm basically talking out of my ass. I have no idea if this show is any good at all, but I'm just going to sit here and say it's terrible.
All right. So I think you answered this before. So we had a lot of questions about guns. What's best for home defense, CCW? Yep. You kind of covered this. One of my other friends, Glenn, one of our instructors from the UK, was asking about what do you think is the right age to introduce your kids to guns if you want them to be trained and comfortable with them?
And that's a good question. So I don't know if there is an exact age that would be appropriate. I mean, obviously they would need to be at an age where you can communicate with them and they can follow instructions and directions. So that would probably be a baseline. But for me, so I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys and a girl. They've all shot guns. And my theory when it comes to introducing guns to anybody, but specifically kids, and the rule that I set for my kids is that anytime that they are curious or have questions or if they want to touch a gun, I will absolutely make sure that that's possible. And we'll make sure that it happens, but it's going to be in an incredibly controlled setting. And the reason that I want that to be a two-way conversation is I want to remove any of this like mystique or allure to them, because we've all heard the horror stories of, you know, kid finds a gun, or he knows his dad has a gun and it's in the sock drawer, and the next thing you know, there's a loss of life of a child. And I don't want my kids to be curious about them to the point that they want to mess with them when they're not under my supervision. So every time though, that they've asked to use a gun, I will sit there and we'll talk with them, and I'll get a gun, whatever they want to work with. And I'll say, okay. And I pretty much the same thing every time. You know, how do we treat this gun? No, we treat it like it's loaded. Do we ever point it at anything that we wouldn't want to shoot or kill? No, we never do. Do we ever put our finger on the trigger when we're not getting ready to shoot the gun? No, we never do. And I'll have them show me where they're going to put their finger on the trigger. Talking about, you know, what would you do if you were with your friends and you guys found a gun somewhere? What would you do? You know, I would not touch it. I would send somebody to go get an adult, and we would make sure that somebody was watching it till an adult came back. Awesome. Okay, let's talk about how a gun works. How do you properly, if you needed to pick up a gun, how could you ensure that it was unloaded? You know, you remove the source, take the source of the ammunition out, empty the chamber, and visually inspect the chamber. And then again, even though you know it's not loaded, how do we treat it? You know, we treat it like it's loaded at all times. And what I found is, for the first few times, they were incredibly interested. And at some point, they realize it's just a tool, and they're interested in shooting. So we sit down and we shoot, and I can talk to them about marksmanship. But those initial lessons are never, ever lost on them. Gun safety is always paramount. Control of your muzzle is always paramount. Trigger discipline is always paramount. And we just talk about it over and over and over again. And I make them teach me. But if you had like I love Powditch. If you had to pin me on a wall for an age, I'd say, 7 or 8, they start to understand.
Sure.
And I'm not an expert in child development, but I think that's probably the first time I fired a gun. Or maybe I haven't even fired a gun. Maybe they just wanted to handle a gun or to hold a gun. So I'd say somewhere around there. Or don't with your kids if you don't feel comfortable. That's how it works.
Right. That kind of feeds into another question that people were asking about. And that's drills. For example, dry fire drills. How beneficial and not beneficial do you find those kind of drills?
I have fired, I can't say I have fired. I have dry fired weapons more than I have fired live rounds. And I would easily estimate I've shot over 1 million rounds between the multiple platforms. For one, there is an ammo shortage right now, like we were talking about. So this is going to save you money and time driving around trying to find 9mm. But it's critical because one, it displays about 80% of shooting is going to go bad in this motion right here, where you start controlling the trigger, smoothly pulling through the brake, allowing it to surprise you. You shouldn't be surprised like, a gun went off. It should surprise you when it actually breaks and the firing pin comes forward. But you can work on all of that without shooting around. It's not the same as shooting. You're going to need to pair back and forth because you're going to know when you actually have bullets inside of the gun, and you're going to want to anticipate or overcompensate with one of your hands. But dry firing drills are great. And I have a concealed carry holster and I have a range belt, and I'll do a lot of practice of, for concealed carry, the draw stroke is more complicated because you're going to have to move clothing out of the way. So I'll practice with which hand I'm going to use, pulling the clothing out of the way, indexing the pistol, and then presenting it to the target. No bullets, obviously. And I'll do that 20 times a day, every day for people listening. And then my range holster, you can do exactly the same thing. It's an easier draw stroke because you don't have to worry about clearing fabric, but indexing the pistol, presenting it properly, getting the grip with both hands, presenting it on target, making sure that your eyes are acquiring the sights. None of that costs anything but time. But that time that you spend doing that will benefit you on the range. And then when I go to the range, for me, it's not about volume of bullets. And having said that, again, I have shot a lot of bullets. For me, it's more about manipulation. So I'll do drills where I'll just load all my magazines with 1 round. And I'll come from the holster and shoot around and force myself to consistently go through the reload process of smooth and efficient movement, getting it on the first time, reloading it, presenting, second sight picture, engaging, reloading, second sight picture, engaging. Because to me, I understand the mechanics of shooting. For me, that's the the gray area and slop that will come in if you don't practice it over time. It's those reloads, getting to the holster, where your gear is oriented on your belt or however you're carrying it. So, and you need to focus on all that. In addition, the marksmanship itself. And it's not about volume, it's about quality.
That's excellent. Reminds me very much of Jiu Jitsu. You're always going back to the fundamentals and isolating
Oh, yeah.
and drilling it over and over again. And that's the stuff that makes all the difference. Speaking of which, and I think this came from Ray Price, but if you're going to pick 3 to 5 of those drills in order, what would you pick for somebody to work?
The first one would be static dry firing. And so no holster, no anything, dot on the wall. And there's no real benefit to going a crazy amount of distance from that dot. You know, people want to really back up away from their target rapidly. And the accuracy is not going to get any better when you do that. So I'd start 5 to 7 feet from that dot, present it, and just working through the sight alignment, the focus on the front sight, squeezing the trigger, and hopefully as the trigger comes to the breaking point, the firing pin comes forward and you hear that click, your sights are still on that target. So dry firing is awesome. If people have a desire to train from either a range belt or to carry concealed, you have to figure out the way that you're going to get it from the presented position, or, you know, from the holster to the presented position. So I would go to that. I would work your draw stroke. Specifically for concealed carry, you need to work it both ways. You need to work it where you have access to both hands, and then you also need to be able to draw when you only have access to your drawing hand, because you might be needing to frame or create space to, or actually get your gun out of the holster. So you need to practice both. They're not the same by any stretch. And then I would go to the range and I would focus on slow fire. So both of those first drills were dry, and then I would go to the range and I'd get a box of 50 bullets, and I'd probably put 5 rounds in each magazine, and I would focus on slow, consistent, thoughtful firing of just trying to put round on top of round on top of round until you feel very comfortable with that. And then and only then would I introduce any level of speed.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Rich Bopit, who runs SPG Niagara for us, said that oftentimes when he hears you talk, there's a lot of conversation about the positive things that you learned in the military and how that translated to your life as a civilian. But he's more interested in things that you may have learned as it relates to dealing with grief and hardship.
I don't know if I learned anything about dealing with grief and hardship. I mean, hard to quantify whether I have had to deal with more or less than other people. I mean, I've definitely had to bury a lot of friends, but I wish I could give you some tool or trick to dealing with that, but it sucks every time. I mean, it's just soul crushing every time. I mean, the only advice I would give is, don't try to go through it by yourself. You'd be amazed at how many people are probably feeling the same way or struggling. And it wasn't until later in my life that I got much more comfortable in asking for help and talking to professionals. And it's been amazing, the difference that it's had for me. And I completely and utterly advocate for people to do that at all times, because otherwise, I mean, if your car breaks down, where do you go? You go to a mechanic, right? Unless you're an idiot like me and you try to get under the hood, and then I need to get a tow job to the mechanic as opposed to driving it there. Because I'm not an expert on cars, and I'm not an expert on grief and hardship. So I try to find the people who understand how my brain or the brain of human beings works better than I do, and, you know, kind of give them the wheel a little bit. And it's been helpful.
That's good. Last thing, this is also from Glenn. He mentioned a Peter Thiel question. So I don't know if you've heard this one before, but this is a interview question Peter Thiel would give people. And the question was, tell me something that you believe to be true, but that the majority of people would disagree with you about, and bonus points if they'd also find it offensive.
God damn, you should have given me a warning on this one. Something that I believe to be true.
I have a lot of those.
You know, the one thing that was cemented in me from my time in the military that I know for a fact is true is that pure evil does exist. I've squared off with people with the look in their eyes that they have the absolute utter hatred and just desire to wipe the earth clean of everybody who doesn't have an ideology that they have. And a lot of people, you know, they're like, oh, well, you can educate people out of, you know, you could change their mind. No, some of these people, the purest of evil, it absolutely exists. And I think oftentimes people don't believe that because they don't touch it very often, which is a good thing. And I'm glad that they don't. But the only solution to that evil is to wipe it off the face of the earth. And that's a concept that people struggle with. But I mean, that's what I've seen, and that's my belief. I don't know if that's offensive to people, but I've had some interesting conversations. But why can't you just talk to them? It's like, it's not really the time and place when, you know, you're in their house. But
Right. Do you think anybody's capable of that? Do you think they're born that way, or?
I don't know on that one. I definitely believe people can become radicalized.
Mm-hmm.
And if you catch them early, you know, at a very malleable time in their life, and it's the only truth that they're ever told is, you know, is that messaging. But I think there's a difference between that and somebody like Adolf Hitler. I mean, what the hell, right? I mean, how do you get that so far gone? I don't think that was taught into him. I think he came out of the box like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, we'll end it up on jiu-jitsu. I always have a lot of jiu-jitsu questions, but generally the questions are about training as you get older,
Yep.
Lessons you may have learned in the military that translated to jiu-jitsu, or things that you've learned from jiu-jitsu that you think may have translated, if you'd known previously, may have actually translated into skills in the military.
Training as you get older. It's kind of self-critiquing. If you can barely walk or get out of bed in the morning, maybe take it easy. Okay. I turned 43 in a couple weeks. I avoid 20-year-old white belts who look like they've spent 19 years around a weight stack. I'll catch them a little bit later on, like 12, 15, 20 rounds later when they're exhausted, and I'll lay on top of them. I mean, I think it's self-critiquing. I think you have to be careful. Again, it goes back to individual accountability and responsibility. Mm-hmm. I was having this conversation. I just finished class with Travis in Open Mat, and I was talking with one of the guys. We had some awesome rolls today, and it's, you know, you got to take accountability and responsibility. It's a tool. Jiu-jitsu is a tool. If you are in your 40s and you go full back dive on every single roll, and you're totally gassed and you're completely sore the next day, that's not jiu-jitsu's fault.
Right.
You're an idiot. You know, you're taking a tool. I mean, you're not an idiot, but trust me, I support that behavior because that's basically what I do at Open Mat. I'm being a total hypocrite right now, but it's not jiu-jitsu's fault. It's the tool. So grab a hold of the steering wheel and take your foot off the gas a little bit, and you'll be okay. Or don't. Do whatever the hell you want to do, because I actually kind of enjoy watching both. But and there was another question in there. I mean, I saw one was asking about the introduction of knives and guns. This is something that I'm going to start doing with Travis, because I've been shooting with him 2 days a week. And I think shooting is a great skill addition to jiu-jitsu, because why wait for your skill set to begin when somebody touches you?
Right.
And I mean, if for people who haven't actually been in a fight, it sucks when people get their hands on you. You can win fights and still end up in the hospital. Like, it's not this movie John Wick shit where you're going to go flying through glass, and at the end of the day, you're just going to be like, oh, I'm good. No, you're going to be, it sucks. And there are tools out there that allow you to master and manage other distances. And guns are a great example of that. Edged weapons are a great example of that. My personal feeling on edged weapons, I'm not as big of a fan as I am of guns, because I have cut myself with more knives than I could ever cut anybody else with. And that's, I mean, they do cut both ways. There's not a single knife that I own that I haven't cut myself with, because I'm constantly messing with it. It's completely my fault, but they're sharp. And again, this John Wick, you know, fancy, like all this stuff going on. No, man, you have a serrated edge that's going to catch on a t-shirt, and then it's going to bounce. And like, that's, I don't like the hydraulic fluid leaking. So let's manage our distance and ranges. But having said that, I actually have some blue guns on order, and I'm going to work with a small group of people here at SBG in Kalispell to implement blue gun training, because it's important, you know, to manage and master that distance inside of, you know, I think the statistic that's thrown around often is 21 feet. Somebody 21 feet and in can get to you before you can get your gun. Yeah. People will sit there and they'll say, yeah, I don't know about that. Well, let's go onto the mats and let's figure it out. Let's roll around in street clothes. You love this holster and you seem to like this middle of the back concealed carry. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's play. I'm going to tackle you, and I'm going to put all of my weight onto your waist in an attempt to make a lifelong bruise of that pistol shape on your back, and let me know how well that pistol does for you. And, so it gives you the chance to check out your gear in a pressure test. And it's important for people to know too, like I said, guns being a Harry Potter wand, just because you have one on you doesn't mean that it solves problems. Because if somebody closes that distance and you get caught with both of your hands down and they're able to bear hug you, you might be in the fight of your life. And guess what? You had a gun. If you thought that that gun meant that you were going to be safe, you're incredibly wrong. So you have to introduce that stuff. And it just gives you that buffer of space and distance and time. So that is something that I'm going to add for sure. And then, stuff that I've learned through jiu-jitsu that would have helped me at my old job, I think it is more of a continuation of the lessons that I learned in the military. For me in that job, if I got to a place where I had to put my hands on somebody, things had gone incredibly wrong because I always managed my distance. If somebody ran at me looking the way that I looked like I just came out of a spaceship in that part, there's no reason for somebody to do that. That's a hostile act. And I'm going to take action based off of that. So I can't necessarily say there's anything that I have learned that would have changed my mindset in the military, but it has been a great continuation of the things that I have learned outside of the military.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great combination of guns and jiu-jitsu. I also think most people are going to find it's more like 30 feet for most people, 35.
Oh, and that's if you get your draw clean. That's right. If you can index down and get the shirt out of the way, or like for an appendix carry, you have to get all of, like, if you have one stutter step where your hand doesn't hit the pistol grip, what you need to actually do is bail on the pistol draw and either get to a place where you can get your feet in on guard, right? Or you get feet on the hips so you can then actually draw. Because if you get smashed or if you get wrapped up and your hands are down, I mean, shit, I hope your bottom game's good.
Well, speaking of the body, I'll tell you a funny story. I was teaching the stand-up headlocks for class and for the online university, and I did about 2 hours with Liam and Salome where they're holding me and we would freeze so I could talk. So I was bent over like this, and for about 3 days I could hardly walk, and the whole front right side of my body had tightened up to where I was struggling to get out of bed, and I had to go train with Ray Price last weekend. And I went, we did a whole day of shooting, and I got back, and the next morning I could barely get out of bed, and we went to the gym to train some jiu-jitsu, and I told him, I'm like, you know what, let's just roll. I don't want to warm up. And, I went after him. I went pretty hard after him. I don't think he went very hard, but I went after him. We rolled for a little while. And from that moment where he and I rolled until now, so it's been about 5 days, I'm gold. My body feels great. So there's that too.
Yeah.
I heard Hickson say the same thing. He said that anything he does hurts except the jiu-jitsu. He can roll and feels good. Teaching jiu-jitsu can hurt, but just rolling and you feel good. I guess after a lot of years, your body just perfectly compensates for movement.
I mean, I know very little about jiu-jitsu, but it seems like with the right training partner, it's, you're warming up, you're stretching, you're going through range of motion. It doesn't have to be every time a hammer and a nail.
Right. Well, last question, and this is also from Ray. If you could go back and tell yourself some advice 20 or 30 years ago, what would you tell yourself?
Well, shit, if I was 30 years ago, I'd only be 13.
Yeah, let's go when you were in your 20s.
Yeah. So early 20s, I mean, I was already in the SEAL community. I remember early on, it'll tie it back into jiu-jitsu because I wish I would have started a long time ago, which I suspect every single person who wasn't raised with the last name of Gracie on the mats at the age of 6 days probably says. Yep. But I remember messing around with guys, and there was a buddy of mine who, thinking back now, I don't think he was doing jiu-jitsu, but there was an essence of grappling to it because we would go and we would mess around at one of the base gyms. And it was awesome because he would just whip our ass. And I have no idea what level of experience that he had, but I know he was better at it than me. Mm-hmm. And I can only imagine what the difference in my game would be, or the knowledge, or like, the other things that would have been potential for me in my life if I had started back then. So I would have told myself to go and find a place and get in on the ground floor instead of starting in your 40s.
Sure. You know what? I said that was the last question, but I want to ask you one more question, because when I was there in Reno, I did a podcast with a good guy that's one of Ray's friends. He does more political commentary, and he asked Ray and I to pick a number from 1 to 10 about how distressed we felt about the general politics of the United States and as it relates to where the country's going. And I think I gave a 3, and I think Ray gave a 3, and I think he came in somewhere at an 8 or a 9.
I'm assuming the higher number was the more distressed.
Higher number was more distressed. And I'd be
well, I tell you what. Yeah, it's interesting that you asked this question after watching the debate last night.
Right.
And
Painful.
I mean, I don't know what I expected, but I didn't expect it to sound like it did. Right. And I'm not trying to say one person did more than the other. Just as an ecosystem, just to observe the whole system it plays, it's disheartening for me that this is where we are at. Yeah. I don't think there's a threat to the republic, because I do believe our system is a pendulum and it does go left and right. And, so it's not going to stay in the middle all the time. And it needs to go a little bit crazy to find its true north, or that balance. I'll probably put myself at a 3 as well. But I mean, it's embarrassing. Yeah. I can't imagine the rest of the world, what they think watching that dumpster fire of what can only be put in air quotes as a debate. And I think it's a pretty good indication of the state of the system. If those are the two options and that's how they feel they need to conduct themselves to win the election, then we have some work to do. And I think it can be done. But man, that was so hard to watch.
Very hard to watch, yeah. Painful almost.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Andy, I always learn something talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I know all the students are going to love hearing this on the podcast. So there any place, URL or any place you want to send them to? Or?
Nah, they can go search the internet to their heart's desire. Go find whatever you want to. Go look at unicorns and gummy bears. I don't give a shit.
Nice. All right. Thanks, Andy.
All right. See you, Matt.